Thank you. I don't want to. Okay, I think we should start the conference now. Thank you very much. So my name is Henri Bergeron. I am the Dean of the School of Public Affairs, and I'm very happy to be here to start this very important meeting, a dialogue, a Franco-German dialogue on European ambition on defense and the transatlantic link. This is an issue I'm absolutely not knowledgeable about, but I'm very interested in listening to the people we have here to speak in front of you today. So I'm very pleased to have Tobias Cremer, who is a German member of the European Parliament, and on the top of that, I would say, he is a Sciences Po alumni, and he will give his perspectives on the very important issues on the question of the European integration facing the different challenges regarding our safety, security, also on how EU institutions and member states can coordinate. This is always an issue, as you know, in European affairs, more effectively to strengthen European strategic autonomy in this very troubling time. This event is to give to students, but also to the academic community, an insight into, in particular, the EU position in a shifting global environment, but also to have some interesting discussion about what should be the link, the relations, and I would say the position that we should have in front of our American ally. This event is also taking place after a discussion, a conversation that already took place last year in the context of the Pariser Platz dialogue. Sorry for my French-German accent.
Very good.
And I must confess I learned German for 10 years, but I'm absolutely unable to speak anymore. And in that context of the Pariser Platz dialogue, last year we welcomed Tobias Lindner, Minister of State at the German Federal Foreign Office, and so we are in a position to build on those reflections, on the reflections that took place in the context of this first meeting. So I would like to thank our partner, of course, the Paris School of International Affairs of Sciences Po, which is co-hosting with us this conference, but of course the Jacques Delors Center and the Professor Ronald Atto, who will be moderating this discussion. So I give the floor to you right now, to Nguyen. You are acting co-director of the Jacques Delors Center, and I think that you'd like also to make some introductory remarks. Thank you very much to all the participants and to this impressive audience.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Dear Tobias Cremer, dear Monsieur Bergeron, dear guests, a very warm welcome also from my side. I would keep my remarks rather brief, but first of all, I would like to thank the German Federal Foreign Office for making today's event possible within the framework of our Pariser Platz dialogue, which we have mentioned, which is called Pariser Platz dialogue because the main event will actually take place at the Pariser Platz in Berlin. I would also like to thank our partners at Sciences Po, the Paris School of International Affairs and the School of Public Affairs, and of course their teams for making this event possible and for hosting us. We have a very long-standing partnership with Sciences Po, and are very grateful to have the possibility to have these Franco-German exchanges, which are also a big part of our work at the Jacques Delors Center in Berlin, to further mutual understanding and thinking about how to address the challenges that we as Europeans face together, including defense. We all know Europe is facing unprecedented threats, on our societies, on our democracies, on our security. And in May this year, on our previous Spotlight event in Berlin, Christine Lagarde spoke about how to strengthen the euro as a reserve currency. And one point that she made in her speech was the importance of having a credible defense that can act as a deterrent to anyone threatening European societies and economies. And I think today's Spotlight event, which is sort of the counterpart of the May event, connects very well to that theme. So in a context of uncertainties over the new US administration policies and the ongoing security threats, Europe must bolster its own defense capacities and also navigate an ever more strained transatlantic link, which leads us to the title of today's event. And before coming here, I saw that the European Commission actually this afternoon presented its EU defense industry transformation roadmap and the military mobility package, including plans for military Schengen. So I think the timing for this discussion could also not be better. And we are very delighted to have a very special guest with us, Tobias Cremer, member of the European Parliament. Tobias Cremer, you were elected to the Parliament in 2024 on the list of Germany's Social Democratic Party, one of the two parties, of course, that is forming the current German government coalition, and also the party from which a German Minister of Defense comes. So a topic today, also an area that we will, of course, discuss today very much. You are a member of the European Parliament Committee on Foreign Affairs, member of the Committee on Security and Defense, which has only been established as a full committee in December 2024. So I think that also tells us quite a bit where we are in this discussion on European defense. You are a member of the Delegation for Relations with the United States and member of the Delegation for Relations with the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. So I cannot think...
Full title, Transatlantic Link.
Transatlantic Link. And as we have heard, an alumni of Sciences Po, so I cannot think of a better speaker than you for today's topic. We very much look forward to your presentation, which will be followed by a moderated discussion with Professor Ronald Hatto. Also, thank you for being here today.
Thank you for the invitation.
And then finally, there will be ample opportunities for a Q&A also with you, the audience. And with that, thank you, Tobias Cremer, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Et vite fait, seulement parce que j'ai un peu l'impression d'être la première fois ici, à ce côté de la salle, qu'il faudrait qu'au moins mes professeurs aimeraient bien si je parlais un tout petit peu en français pour montrer le respect pour l'institution, bien sûr, mais aussi parce que ça me fait vraiment penser, je crois, la dernière fois que j'étais dans la salle, j'étais quelque part là-bas, je faisais un examen d'anglais pour aller en troisième année. Donc, c'est pas... Je suis revenu malgré tout cela. Il n'y avait pas trop PTSD. Mais voilà, je vais changer. Je vais faire ce que font très, très souvent mes collègues canadiens, qui parlent toujours dans une langue, and they just switch into the other language, and they just go back and forth. But I'm not going to do that. I'll just stick to English for now, unless you have, like, specifically afterwards questions in French, so I'll just do that. And thank you really for the invitation. It's a great honor to be here. It's especially also a great honor to follow Tobias Lindner. He was my boss in the Foreign Office when I was still working there, and it always feels a little bit funny in this respect, and I'm wondering how many other Tobiases you'll find in German parliaments doing defense and policy for next year. Anyway, so I actually don't want to speak all too long. Instead, I thought really I'll tell you a little bit about myself, how I actually got here after Sciences Po, bien sûr, but then really have a quick introduction into the topics that we are talking about. But I think what is really interesting for me is also getting into the discussion, hearing from your perspective, having the moderated part. But maybe just a few words about myself, because it wasn't always, I was never, even though I did Sciences Po, I didn't actually think that I would ever end up in a position doing actually electoral politics. I come from a quite industrial area in Germany, from the area of the Ruhr. For those who like bad football, it's from Bochum, makes you very resilient. Basically I was also very lucky to the extent that I was the first person in my family to have a scholarship and to be able to be the first person in my family to go and study abroad. So I then came to Sciences Po à Nancy, and was able to make Europe a bit more than just something we'd learn in school or the university, but it really became the foundation of how I lived, of the idea what I was going to do. So I was here, then was lucky enough to do troisième année in the UK. Stayed there, did my PhD there, went to the US for a little while, and I actually thought that I'd stay in academia because I really, really loved that part and being in the university environment. But for me, and I think I'm not the only one, the 24th of February 2022 was also a personal Zeitenwende, as we say in Germany. Because in some ways, obviously, if you study international relations, you know that war and geopolitics never went away. But if you grew up in the center of Europe, you felt very much that's a problem either from far ago or from far away. And all of a sudden, we actually had students at the university where I was teaching who were about the same age that I had when I was the first one in my family to go from Bochum to discover Europe and the world. But they gave up their scholarship in Oxford to go to Ukraine because they were from Ukraine and they wanted to do something for their country and for this European idea. And that brought home to me in a way I just, like still now, it sometimes feels weird to think about that I actually then, you see that very much live. The war in Europe. I was just in Kiev a couple of months ago and just again seeing this so close to us, this really active war, and talking to so many people who are on the front lines fighting for this European idea that we just took for granted. And back in the day, I also then really felt like I can't just watch this or teach about that from the outside. I really want to be part of that also because our chancellor then called out the Zeitenwende. I really felt I hadn't been happy with German foreign policy, especially not that of my party, for quite a long time. So I also felt like this is a chance to actually participate in that. It's something that I always felt was necessary. And this is why I then decided to go back to Germany. I actually joined the Foreign Office. I was a very happy diplomat. It was a fantastic time. And I was actually the desk officer for the Baltic countries, which once again gave you a little bit of a perspective. Those of you who are familiar with that, the German brigade, that was basically my bread and butter issue. And it's thanks to Boris Pistorius that we then solved that issue. But it really gave you a bit of a perspective. But at the same time, we increasingly also had that debate in German domestic politics about how to do the Zeitenwende in the long run. And that this was not going to be a short crisis of a year or two, but that something, in some ways, what was happening in Ukraine was a symptom of something much broader, where we actually have to rethink how our society works, not just our foreign policy, but our society writ large. And that debate was really happening on the ground. And I was then actually asked by people in my party, I was probably some of you here as well, I was a very cool teenager and joined a political party when I was 14. Wasn't then super active for quite a while, but when then I was asked whether I could imagine at all running, I did, because I felt like this is a debate we have to have. I actually, full disclosure, didn't think at all that I might be elected, but it's also one of the signs, and maybe those who are interested in electoral politics, I don't want to say it's easier than you think, but it's a real chance even if you haven't done electoral politics for ages. I actually had candidates running against me at every level, and just by saying very clearly what I thought, somehow it happened that they kept electing me up on the list, and so I ended up now in the European Parliament. I'm the only German Social Democrat in the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committees. By virtue of that, I'm also the spokesperson for Foreign Affairs and Defense. Has advantages in terms of we now tend to be pretty much united because I tend to agree with myself. But it's obviously also quite a challenge to do this, especially at this time, because as you rightly mentioned, we have to be very clear about the geopolitical reality that we are facing in Europe, and not just vis-à-vis Ukraine. We are now facing probably the greatest geopolitical threat, at least in my generation, and some would say since 1945. Because we see very clearly that Putin has invaded Ukraine, not for the territory of Ukraine, but he has said it clearly again and again, this is about the European peace order. And he is now rearming not just with the perspective of Ukraine, but with the declared aim to be capable of attacking NATO territory, or at least testing NATO's resolve, not in some distant future, but by the end of this decade. And it's not just words. We see the movement of Russian production lines going in that direction. Not everything that Russia produces is going to Ukraine. A lot of that is actually going towards the eastern flank. Now, as I said, this is about the capacity to test NATO. What our task is now to deter him from this military threat scenario. We have to be able to deter any Russian aggression. But I also think we have to be very clear that this threat is not purely military, but this threat is much broader. We talk a lot about hybrid warfare, and we have to understand what is Putin's motivation here, what is he actually doing. A lot of people are saying Putin is conducting his war because he's afraid of NATO. I actually don't think that's true. I wish he was more afraid of NATO. Maybe he wouldn't have attacked in the first place. But what Putin is terrified of is successful Western liberal democracies. Why? Because they undermine the rule that his autocratic, they undermine the arguments that his autocratic rule is based upon. And especially, he's terrified of successful liberal democracies in former Soviet Union colonies, so to speak. As I mentioned, I was the desk officer for the Baltic countries. And if you go to Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, I don't know whether any of you are from these countries, but sometimes it actually feels like you are time traveling into the future. These are some of the greatest success stories that Europe really has. They joined in 2004, and they are much further progressed when it comes to digitization, etc., but even on the educational system. And that is terrifying for Putin. Because his narrative has always been, oh, if you are Russian, you are Homo Sovieticus, so liberalism and democracy, that's just for Westerners. We are different. If you are Homo Sovieticus, like, you need authority. You can't really decide for yourself for your own good. But the Baltics are showing that the contrary is true. And as a result, you have in a lot of other countries, whether it be Georgia, whether it be Moldova, whether it be Ukraine in 2014, where people are saying, actually, I don't want to live like Russians have to live. I want to determine our own future. And that is what Putin is absolutely terrified of. And I think we have to understand that. Because that means even if we have tomorrow some sort of ceasefire, Putin will not stop thinking that our democracies are, by their existence, a threat to his rule. And this is why he will continue to target exactly the working of our liberal democracy. This is why we see this large scale of hybrid warfare, which is not new, by the way. We've seen that for years. It's just intensifying now, and we are starting to pay attention. And it's not just the cutting of infrastructure cables in the Baltic Sea, where you have a lot of ships that accidentally keep their anchor dragging behind them times and times again. You don't just have spying on our infrastructure. You don't just have the paralyzing of our airports with Russian drones. I was the victim of that recently myself, because we were trying to fly to Brussels, and lo and behold, Belgium is currently thinking about using or allowing the use of Russian frozen assets, and all of a sudden there are drone attacks all over Belgium. And the Brussels airport was closed. There were drones over military airports. There were drones over Liège, etc., etc. And this is happening more and more in all of our societies. I think in Germany, we need to be clear about the dimensions. I think in Germany alone, in the last year, we had a damage to the German economy of 270 billion euros due to hybrid attacks. That's 3 times our defense budget that year. And we need to understand not everything of that is Russian, but more and more of it is, and we need to understand that we remain a target. But perhaps the most dangerous way of this hybrid warfare is the very targeted and very clear disinformation campaigns that we have in our societies. Putin is scared of a working democracy where people trust democratic institutions, where there is some sense of social cohesion, and this is why he really pushes into that. This is why we have armies of bots that are interfering in our social media, that are interfering into our elections, and this is why, you can read it, the Russians are very open about it, they try to also mobilize and use extremist parties in our own countries that, and I tell you very clearly, if you ever doubt about that, listen to the speeches of some far-right and unfortunately also some far-left groups in the European Parliament. They're just singing the tunes of Radio Moscow. And it's very, very clear. And Russia itself is saying we have to strengthen these parties because they undermine any sort of cohesion in our societies. So I think we need to be clear about the military threat, but also about the hybrid threat to our societies, be it economic, but also really social, that we are facing from Russia. The problem is, that's not all. In some ways, we had that during the Cold War, and we kind of managed. But what is hard, even harder now, is that for the first time in 80 years, we are facing that threat potentially alone. Because for the last 80 years, we could somewhat rely on the Americans doing the heavy lifting for us in the worst-case scenario. That has changed. In some ways, it shouldn't be a surprise. A lot of people have talked about Trump's election or his policy as a wake-up call. Having lived in the UK, in the US, I never found it to be a wake-up call. It reminded me much more of when your alarm ringing again after you've pressed the snooze button for 10 times, and then you're surprised it's going on for the 11th time. You really shouldn't be. So it's the time not just to wake up, but to finally get up and to face up to the reality that has been a geopolitical trend for at least 10 years, if not longer, and that is a political trend that will continue even if Trump is tomorrow replaced by a fantastic Europe-loving, democratic progressive. Things will move in that direction. It might not even be the worst for us in the long run to become more independent, but we have to face that reality that in the next couple of years we have to balance that. So the situation that Europe is currently facing is pretty challenging. That's clear. Now the question is, of course, what can Europe do about it? And the good news is that over the last 3 years, we've actually moved, at least on the debates, towards a couple of convergences that I think are really essential. The first one is that there's a convergence on the European level, that we actually admit that Russia is a threat and considers us as a target. That was not clear before, especially in my own home country, but that is now, we are now considering that, and there's large-scale agreement about that. That's positive. In a way, there's also convergence when it comes to the transatlantic relationship. Because before you'd say, maybe on the one side, they're the Gaullists, and then on the other side, and they're maybe German, but also the Baltics, who really are transatlantic, etc. In some ways, that still exists. But both camps now understand that what you have to do is the same. Because if you want to become more independent of American power, because you think Europe should be, in principle, then, of course, what you have to do is to invest more in your own defense and do more, become more independent very clearly. But even if you want to keep the Americans on board, what's the best thing to do? It's to invest into our own defense and actually show America that we are an ally that is worth having, that we are actually a pretty good ally to have. We are not dependent. We need to move on the transatlantic relationship from one of big brother, little brother, to really a much more even division of labor and also burden sharing. So that's good news because we actually agree what we need to do. And the final one is to discuss what Europe should actually do in that context. Because before we had a lot of debates always, should Europe become, should we have a European army? Should we do more CSDP and all of these things? And I think given the threat perception that we're having right now, our answer should be very clear. We have a European army. It's called NATO. Should become more European, clearly. But it's actually pretty good at the operational things that it does. What is lacking, though, is somewhere and where Europe can actually do something that NATO can't do, is providing the industrial base to actually acquire the capabilities we need to defend ourselves. NATO cannot do that. Europe can. But we haven't for many decades because we considered defense in a best-case scenario as something where you send some troops for like some special mission, and in a worst-case scenario, you just basically equip your armies to look great on a national parade day. we have allowed 27 mini markets of defense to evolve that have produced capabilities that don't really work, that aren't interoperable. We have, I think, 12 different tank models where the Americans have won. And even if you have the same tank model, even if you have the Leopard 2 in Germany and Spain, for instance, they can't use the other's ammunition. The people who drive them can't drive the other one because the German has to have like this special specification, the Spanish one has the other one. So we actually have acquired capabilities that served more as an industrial boosting or program than actually to serve the military needs that they need to fulfill. And that needs to change. We have spent also way more on defense than or the prices we pay are way too high for what we're actually getting. The Draghi report showed that actually at the moment we are paying about 30% too high prices for the capabilities that we have, not because we are doing anything wrong, but just not because we want to, but it's just because we don't coordinate. We don't coordinate in our procurement, and we don't actually create the conditions for our defense industry to move to scale, to actually become the champions that we need internationally to be able to produce the capabilities desperately needed. So what we need to do on a European level, and this is why in some ways you mentioned the Defense Committee is new. We also have now for the first time a Defense Commissioner, Kubilius, another great Baltic leader. But if we are entirely honest, and actually if you talk to him, he'll say it himself, our committee should not be called the Committee for Defense. It should be called the Committee for Defense Industry. And he should be the Defense Industrial Commissioner, because that is what the European Union can really do. We can actually create what we can do best, a common market, but for defense. We can actually make sure that they are the common norms and standards. That's what we are good at. If you think about NATO is actually fantastic at setting standards, but they can't enforce them. And then we have a fantastic institution that isn't fantastic at enforcing norms and standards, but we can't at the moment because we don't have a cooperation agreement between NATO and the EU. So we need to move further on that to actually use that leverage. And then on the other side, we need to use the EU to actually coordinate the procurement of defense. Once again, we can use things like SAFE, etc. It's not about the EU buying defense goods, actually not allowed to, but we can incentivize it by saying, here's money that member states can use, but you can only get it if you actually procure together. So that is the one side that Europe can really do, and I think a lot of things are already happening on that front. Another thing Europe can do is help, of course, also with the financing. Just mentioned the SAFE program, but I think if we are entirely honest, Germany has just done something that was very good, loosened the debt brake for defense. Fantastic. A lot of countries in Europe can't do that to the same extent. So I think in Europe we also need to start thinking about, and I know it's weird to hear that from a German, but defense bonds. We might have to think about common sources of financing for defense, because a lot of countries can't do what Germany is doing and borrow that from its own perspective. We also have to actually move on the capital, the private capital market, to make sure that our defense industry, I'm not talking about the Rheinmetall and Dassault, they have enough money, but our small and medium companies, our startups, they need private investment. But at the moment, if they go to a private bank and say, we want to do something in defense or dual use, the banks say, ooh, no, that is, German would say Schmuddelecke. That is something that we don't really want, that is a little bit uncomfortable for us. And what happens? Either they don't have any money to scale up, or you have American investors come in. So there, once again, we need a capital market union to actually have the investments ready for the small and medium companies. The third thing, and I want to finish on that Europe can do, though, is I just talked about defense. And it's very clear that we need defense goods, and we need them quickly, and we need them in a good quality. But we also have to be really, really clear about that in Europe, security and defense was never just about tanks and drones. In Europe, our security is primarily based on what Putin is so scared of, and that is social cohesion, is actually faith in our democracies, is actually a societal resilience to these authoritarian tendencies and regimes. And I think it's absolutely essential that we understand on a European level that if we want to succeed with this Zeitenwende, with this shift in era, with this increased spending in defense, we must not make the same mistake that a lot of us made, unfortunately, with the green transition. That is to do something that is absolutely necessary, but to allow for a narrative to evolve that pits social cohesion against necessary investments in the green transition. And that allowed for populists to create a culture war around it, saying that is only something for the rich, and it goes at the expense of normal working people. So what we need to do is, from the beginning, set up this Zeitenwende as a socially sustainable thing, to understand that security, especially in times of hybrid warfare, you can only get if you understand external security and social cohesion, not as opposites, but as two sides of one and the same medal. And once again, it's nothing that is entirely new and mind-blowing. Just go to our Nordic neighbors. I was just in Norway a couple of weeks ago. Finland is another example. But the Norwegians actually just wrote their national security strategy. And it's fascinating. It's their national security strategy. Before they start talking about tanks and drones, the first thing they talk about is social cohesion and trust in democratic institutions. So what we need to do in Europe is to have this investment in defense, but we need to embed it into a clear, broader investment strategy that shows that it's not one at the expense of the other, but together. Once again, I'm very happy that Germany actually tried to do that, opening the debt brake, but connecting it with 500 billion in infrastructure. But this is really where we have to get to in the European Union. Because, and I'll probably end on that, but I think it's really, really essential to understand that European citizens are expecting rightly that Europe is there to defend their physical safety. If you look at Eurobarometer, actually, if you ask people what do you expect more from the European Union, they don't talk about even the economy or migration. First thing they talk is security and defense. People are ready for that, politicians maybe not. But at the same time, they rightly expect that Europe remains something worth defending in the first place. Because what makes this special, I think we sometimes have to remember, is that this Europe we have here is not normal. It's not self-evident. It's the only place in the world where we don't only have a certain level of wealth and freedom, but also where we have the idea of a welfare state and a social cohesion as a priority. That doesn't really exist outside of this European Union. At least I haven't seen many countries where that exists. That is what makes us strong. That is what makes us, ultimately gives me faith that we can win this. This is the reason why so many people want to live like we do in Europe rather than like they do in China or like they do in Russia. But I think we need to also have a little bit more of self-confidence that this is something worth defending, but we also need to make sure that it continues to stay that way. Thank you very much. Sorry, I probably talked for too long.
So thank you very much for your very clear and very convincing defense of the EU, and I appreciate the fact that you terminated on the social elements. In 1979, Michael Howard, the British historian, published a very interesting short article entitled "The Four Forgotten Dimensions of Strategy," and one of them was social cohesion. And what is the main problem at the moment in the EU with this notion of social cohesion? Is there any weaknesses? If I'm not wrong, you just mentioned towards the end of your presentation that we should insist more on the fact that we should be more self-confident in our own capacity. And Raymond Aron in 1977 published a book with a very controversial title. In French, it was à la défense de l'Europe décadente. So what he was saying at the time was that Western Europe, at the time we had two Germanys, so we were, there was no doubt that Western Europe was much more powerful, even in terms of culture, in terms of economy, and so on, but at the same time we lacked this famous self-confidence that you just mentioned. So what is lacking at the moment in Europe to face the threat of Russia? And thank you for insisting that there is a real problem with Russia. Yeah. I don't think people realize that, okay? And when you adopt this language, sometimes in universities, but also when you read the comments on social media, that's terrible what people are saying. I think that people are scared of Russia, so they try to banalize what Russia is trying to do right now to us, but we are at war with Russia. So I think that was your point. But coming back to social cohesion, what is the main problem at the moment? I have in mind this Gallup survey of July 2024. You probably passed through it. And I'm sorry for my Italian friends, but I'm not saying that all Italians are just a small batch of Italians, petit échantillon. But to the question, if your country was attacked tomorrow, will you be ready to defend it? And 78% of the Italian respondents said no. And the number 2 country, sorry, Aileen, she's sitting just there, she's from Austria. The Austrians were also not very ready to defend Austria. So, and of course, Germany, if I'm not wrong, was coming forth. Happily, Canada was not included, but I'm certain that Canadians will not be quite ready to defend Canada either. Why? For a big, I think we have a huge problem that Trump emphasized, but Trump is right. We are relying too much on the United States. We delegated our security, our safety to the Americans, and it's not something new. And from Canada also it's a problem. And so coming back to the social dimension, what is the main problem at the moment in Europe?
So I think there are several levels to that. So I actually wasn't too surprised that a lot of people said they wouldn't really be wanting to defend their own country. And you can, historically we had this in Europe, what we would call a beautiful long German word is Bedrohungsperzeptionsasymmetrie. So you had an asymmetry of threat perceptions, which basically meant that if you are close to Russia, if you are Finland or the Baltic countries, you know your neighbor. It's very self-evident. Whereas if you're Germany, you're surrounded by friends. Like, who would do anything?
Portugal or Spain.
Spain, even more. Portugal, interestingly, is actually pretty good on the defense part, so it doesn't work the entire way. But that is the historical part. But as I said, I actually think there is some movement because people are realizing that this war in Europe is not that far away. And I actually think Putin also made a really stupid mistake the last couple of months by being so blatant with his hybrid attacks. Because even those who didn't really want to believe that Putin was conducting a hybrid war against us, if you are on the plane that gets diverted because there are Russian drones, if you are facing cuts in electricity because you realize Russia is cutting infrastructure cables, if you are one of the people being somewhere close where Russia commits a murder in a German park, you start realizing that actually isn't all fake news. That's pretty real. And Putin might think that he can intimidate us, but studies have shown for decades that attacking civilian populations doesn't usually lead to them backing down and actually makes them be more stubborn and say, like, hold on, we actually need to do something about this, because most people have a certain level of pride about their own societies or countries. And I think that is something that he's activating. But what you said with the social part, I think it's also really, really essential that people have the sense that actually this is something worth defending. Because this is really where also the far right is pushing in, and a lot of others, they're actually saying, this system that we have, this liberal democracy, isn't really working for people. Actually gives bad turnouts, and it's a really bad system. Nothing works. And I actually find that always interesting, because they call themselves in the European Parliament patriots for Europe, or in Germany the alternative for Deutschland, and they just keep talking about how Europe is basically bad, how Germany is like useless, etc., etc. To me, that is not a very patriotic thing to do. Anyways, it's an interesting one, but it's clearly trying to create the sense that this is not working. And the problem is, in parts, there are some bases that they can use. There are some real problems in our societies that can be used and abused for that. I mean, in Germany, for instance, as I say, I come from the Ruhr. It's a post-industrial area. There hasn't been a lot of investment for a long time. My sister is an elementary school teacher. The children couldn't use the toilets for a long time because there was no investment for 30 years in the school. I mean, I don't know how many of you have been trying to take German trains recently. It's always an adventure, but it's like we are living in a country where the trains don't run, where bridges don't carry. And that's not just a problem in Germany, it's a problem in Europe, and people have the sense there is the state is actually not working for me. And I think this is why it's so essential that we see this investment system. We need to make sure that the state actually functions, that the state actually works out for people, that the state actually provides what is needed in this new geopolitical setting. And that also means that we need to strengthen the social cohesion, that people need to have the sense there is a sense of solidarity among us. And once again, it's not a miracle thing to do. But we seem to have, and the last German government failed over that, so it's not to underestimate, but we seem to think you can either have a strong defense posture or you can have a strong welfare state, but guns and butter don't go together. They do. Go to Finland, go to Norway, go to Sweden, go to Denmark. They understand that you can only have both. You can't have one without the other. Because if you just do social cohesion, or if you just do the strong welfare state, but you don't defend it, somebody will come and take it away. But if you just put everything into defense, there will be no social support for that. There will be nothing left defending. And I think we need to really internalize that message, that we need to strengthen what is the core of Europe. It is this social cohesion. It is this sense of solidarity within societies and across societies. And as I said, it's something to actually be quite proud of. It's not very frequent in the world, this sense of solidarity. And as I said, for me, one of the things, if you ever doubt, or if you ever have like a sense of like, oh, I don't know, Europe, not that great, go to a country where things are actually at stake. Go to a country like I was in Georgia a couple of months ago, and people there are facing really bad democratic backsliding. There's a government that is using the Russian playbook of intimidation, of really violence in the streets. And we went there as European members of parliament, and it was actually quite crazy because we just wanted to see what's happening on the ground. But as we were walking, some people must have realized, because we didn't tell anybody that we were European members of parliament walking around, somebody must have noticed, and people actually came onto the balconies, came out in the street and started singing the European anthem and waving European flags. Because for them, Europe is the symbol of freedom. For them, Europe is the symbol of a life worth living. They really believe in this sort of European dream that we take for granted. This is the reason why so many people in Ukraine are saying they're ready to die for their self-determination, for their European future. And I think for us to just understand that this is really something worth a lot will be a big step. We need to have that confidence, and actually also to some extent, I think Lars Klingbeil recently talked about European patriotism. It's not the patriotism of the far right. It's not an exclusive patriotism, but it's something about saying, actually, living in a society where I have freedom, where we have solidarity, where I can decide myself what I want to do, but where there's also a sense of taking care of one another, that's actually something to be quite proud of.
And I think you mentioned something interesting. Disinformation is based on real problems that are amplified. In France, you're familiar with France, I think, we have a huge debt and deficit at the moment. So how can you convince the French that they need to strap their belt, okay, and to make efforts, while we find it very difficult? You know, we are debates on the la retraite and stuff like that. So how is it possible? And France is not the only country, I think, where we have a massive debt. So how can we reconcile injecting more money for our defense, which is absolutely vital, I think, but at the same time try not to ruin the country, because we also have other the hospitals in France are, you know, crumbling. Sometimes when you go to the emergency room, it's dramatic. So don't you think it can also affect social cohesion in various states? And of course, Russia and those people working for the Russians are maybe insisting on this fact.
No, absolutely. And I mean, I think on the one hand, basically what we have to get to is that on the one hand, people are saying, I'm actually part of that. I'm invested in that. And there are actually loads of psychological studies that show if you have a shared challenge, people are actually, they want to participate. They want to also do something. This is why I think a whole of society approach to defense is quite essential, where you tell people not just to hoard something in their basements, but really also to say, like, if you want to contribute, if you want to help somebody, where to turn in a case of crisis, what to contribute. People are actually quite willing, if there's a challenge, to work together, and it's actually something that makes humans relatively happy on the one hand. But then on the other hand, you obviously, and that is something that we just have to be realistic about, the amount of money we now need to invest in our defense is so big that even if you cut the welfare state altogether, it wouldn't be enough. And this is why I think we need to start thinking about defense spending differently. It can't just come out of running budgets. Of course, we also have to be clear on budgets. We can't just keep consuming like we always did. Everybody needs to make a little bit of a sacrifice. But we can't just cut that down entirely, and it also wouldn't make economic sense. So what we should do instead is, and as I said, like if in Germany, where the debt brake was more a matter of moral theology than of economics, if in Germany the conservatives are ready to say, okay, let's open that because it actually makes economic sense to invest, to use debt for defense investment, we should start thinking about whether that also isn't the way forward in Europe. I think we have to make sure that we put it on conditions. There has to be, of course, a real responsibility on that. I also think on a European level, if we did do common debt, it should also be in exchange for pooling something like a little bit of sovereignty in terms of we should actually democratize our foreign affairs and defense, have more QMV and all of these things. So you need to give something to receive something. But for all those interested in geeking out a little bit about macroeconomics, there's a fantastic study by the Kiel Institute that is actually about the cost of guns, I think is what it's called. And they were actually calculating if you increase defense budget from 1.5 to 3.5%, what we are basically doing now, there are two scenarios. Either you can increase that at the expense of other investment, but that leads to a lot of cannibalizing. So 2% growth or 2% spending on GDP only leads to, or 2% spending from GDP in defense only leads to 0.9% of growth in GDP. So you actually have a net loss there. But if you do that based on borrowing, so that you don't have a cannibalization with other investment, you can actually have growth of up to 1.9%. So it almost doesn't really pay for itself because it doesn't come out of the budget, etc. But you can actually see that there is more growth possibility if you do it that way, because you actually start having spillover effects when it comes to research and development, all of these things. That just to say that also from financial markets, we actually see that spending or like debt that is used for defense is often considered something that is actually pretty sustainable, because it is the guarantee of the continuation of the state that you want you to pay back eventually. So I think we have to start thinking about these ways. And I mean, if you want to be a European dreamer, you might even hope for a Hamiltonian moment. I wouldn't go quite that far, but I think it's something really worth start seriously think about, just because in some ways there is just no financial headway to pay out of that out of running budgets.
And of course, we should buy Europeans, just like the German decision to buy F-35, I suppose.
To be fair, what are the priorities here? And I think we have to be very, very careful about that. This is, as I say, if we invest in a smart way, we can also have economic growth. But investing in defense is not about economic growth. Investing in defense is about to have the capabilities to defend ourselves in a couple of years' time, by the end of the decade. So where I actually stand right now is, yes, we need to buy European in the long run. Mm-hmm. And this is why, for instance, in EDIP or in SAFE and all of these programs, we have a buy European approach, because we need to actually build the defense capacity to produce what we need. But even if we wanted to buy 100% European right now, we couldn't. We couldn't get the capabilities we need by the end of this decade to actually be able to defend ourselves. So what I'm saying, my top priority is to get bang for the buck. I want to have the best capabilities for the lowest possible price, so we can then have other spending on other priorities. And I want it quickly and reliably. So this is why, for me, I'm saying if in that stage F-35 is the better deal because it's delivered quickly, it's delivered by the end of the decade, then we do that. That is in the short term, to be able to deter. But in the long run, we need to gradually increase the European part so that we don't stand in front of this situation again, where even if we wanted to buy European, we simply currently can't.
Last point. we know deterrence rests on two pillars, okay? Capabilities, so I think you discussed a lot about that, okay? Material capabilities, weapons, but also will to resolve and will to defend. Somebody said that 1 gram of will is worth 2 kilos of muscles. The problem is that we don't know if will be there when we need it, so better invest in muscles. Yeah. So what is the main problem in Europe? And that will be my last question for you, and maybe we can open the discussion with the audience after.
I mean, the problem is, and I think actually it's getting better, but the real problem is that Putin thought that Europe wouldn't be wanting to defend itself. Why did Putin attack Ukraine? Not because he thought this would end up the way it did. He thought he's going to go in 3 days, and then the Europeans would say, "Oh no, that's terrible. Okay, it's too late now. What do we do?" No, he really thought that first of all, the Ukrainians wouldn't defend themselves the way they would. He also underestimated the West. He didn't think that we would actually stick together and support Ukraine the way we did. He didn't want to be in this war right now. He's in trouble as well. We shouldn't underestimate that. But the problem was the misperception of will, because we are democracies, we have these debates, we allow criticism.
Strategic cacophony.
Yeah, strategic cacophony. So I think we need to be very clear. We should keep having these debates, and maybe Putin actually learns, but we need to also have in mind what we signal to Moscow. And I actually have a very good friend who currently, work in the Foreign Office, and I have a couple of friends who now work in Moscow, for instance. And a couple of these people have mentioned to me we actually were pretty close to Putin being ready to negotiate a couple of times. But then every single time he had new hope because somebody in the West said ooh, maybe we shouldn't do this right now, and put a new red line in somewhere. So what we actually need to do is change Putin's calculus. Putin's calculus is that he knows that ultimately, we are much bigger and stronger, and we should remember that. The Russian economy is about the size of the Italian economy. We are much bigger, we are much more successful, and if we wanted to actualize it, Putin also wouldn't stand, he could not be successful attacking us if we stick together. What is really needed is that we show that we are willing to defend ourselves, that we are willing to actually use that capacity. And currently Putin still thinks maybe next month they will give up, maybe next month they'll stop, maybe next month, I don't know, some Gulf buddy of Trump is going to come around again, and we are going to have a chat, and I'm going to go to Alaska, and all of these things. And I think we just need to signal very clearly, first of all, that we are not, we will continue to support Ukraine even if the Americans change their mind, that he understands that we are not just going to stop, and that we are also able and committed in the long run. And this is why I actually think that seizing the Russian assets, or not seizing the Russian assets, using the Russian assets for a reparation loan is actually a very powerful lever in this context. Because by doing so, we show Putin here, regardless of what's going to happen in our societies, Ukraine will have the money to continue this war at least for another couple of years. We are quite serious about this. We are willing to do things that previously we were much more concerned about. And it's also changing the dynamic where Putin, we make the war much more expensive for Putin, because the longer he drags it out, the more he will lose, not just in terms of soldiers, which unfortunately he doesn't care about, but with regards to money, which he does care about. So I think that can actually be a relatively strong signal to Russia, to Putin, that you are not going to win in the long run. And I'm relatively hopeful that might actually drive Putin to the negotiating table, because, maybe last word on that, in some ways we can be grateful to Donald Trump, because he has disproven once and for all basically a ghost theory that we had in Europe for a long time, that if only we appeased Putin, that if only we gave him what he wanted, that if only we forced Ukraine to make concessions, we could have peace and things would change and we could negotiate. I mean, Trump did exactly that. He rolled out the red carpet. He made Ukraine do concessions. He offered Putin, and what did he get? Nothing. Nothing at all. No ceasefire, no negotiations, just more tanks, more rockets on Ukraine. And if you needed it more, he actually, in a despicable act of mockery, attacked our own embassy in Kiev. That is what Putin thinks about diplomatic solutions. So I think we need to finally understand that he understands only strength and commitment, and that actually if we had shown that strength before, we might not have gotten into this place in the first place.
I'm violating my own word. Last question about nuclear extended deterrence, or even what about a German nuclear capacity?
No. I think
And now I'm done.
just very small topic. No, I think we have to be very, very careful when we come to the nuclear issue, because nuclear deterrence isn't just you have a nuclear bomb and then everything is fine, or you don't. Nuclear deterrence, and you can't just replace one nuclear deterrent with another. The French nuclear deterrent is very different from the American nuclear deterrent. I actually think it should be in our interest to keep the nuclear deterrent that has worked for the last 80 years. That is the American nuclear deterrent. And I actually think, because I don't think it's good if we all start having new nuclear weapons. I think that actually makes us less secure rather than more secure across the world. And I also think that, you said it's all like nuclear deterrence is all about psychology. The more nuclear deterrence you have, even for the same continent, you start having a collective action problem, because which nuclear deterrent is gonna pull in the end? I mean, if any of you is bored, watch the House of Dynamite at the moment on Netflix. It's actually quite interesting because it shows how much of it is psychology, how much of it is does the other side actually believe we are using it? Are we actually capable of doing it? Do they think we are capable of doing it? Do we believe that they think that we are, etc., etc. So I actually think, luckily, we have moved to an equilibrium in Europe where the Russians are terrified enough that the Americans might use nuclear weapons, especially if they are already based in Europe. And the question is, how do we keep the Americans on board with that? I really think the good thing is it doesn't cost the Americans much to keep that nuclear deterrent. They've already invested in that. So what we need to do is to show we are very happy and ready to deal with and pay for our conventional defense. And I think in return we can convince the Americans to keep the nuclear deterrence because it doesn't cost much to them in addition. Whereas for us, creating the nuclear deterrent that the Americans have, then 3.5%, 5%, it's not going to be in that order. It's a whole different level, and I think we make the world much less safe. So I'm somebody who's very hesitant about throwing out new nuclear deterrents. I think we should do whatever we can to keep nuclear weapons as limited as possible and to use the umbrella that has protected us over the last 80 years.
Thank you. Dankeschön.
Yeah.
If you have questions, so there is microphone in use. I'm not sure whether you'd like to take 3 questions.
Sure.
And then answer, maybe.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for your remarks. They were very insightful. I was wondering if you had any more specific thoughts on how Europe should, or basically if the European countries should react to Russia's airspace incursions of NATO countries, sort of through NATO, or more within the EU, or in a more European approach, and also obviously what that response should be, if it should be more forceful. I mean, you already advocated for a more forceful approach, but if that something like we saw if we should maybe adopt the Polish approach of saying next time Russia, sends planes into our territory, we are going to shoot these planes down. Yeah, I was just curious if you could give us your comments on that.
Question is for Mr. Cremer?
Yes.
Or?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Or I mean,
Yeah.
both of you. Yeah.
Should I? Do we gather? Or should I can also respond straight away. Basically, yes, we have to have a strong posture, but I think we have to be very careful not to go into Putin's trap, because Putin is starting an escalation circle where he might have an advantage. He really wants to go like drones. It's cheap for him, cost us a lot of money to retaliate, to shoot down. It's not economically viable to shoot down 10,000 euro Shahad drones with like 500,000 euro Patriots, and like that is not sustainable. So what I think is most important, stay cool. We have to be clear about what is happening, be realistic, say yes, they're trying to do that. Build resilience so we can continue to function, build also redundancies, and then look how can we respond, but on a plane where we have the advantage. So instead of saying, okay, I'm following Putin, he's doing incursions, so I'm going to shoot things down, and then he's going to escalate on an area where he might have the advantage, see, where do we have an advantage? We have an advantage when it comes to the economy. So I'd say we put in new sanctions that really hurt Russia. We put in new sanctions against the Shadow Fleet, or, once again, we think about using Russia's frozen assets, because he cares about that. He doesn't care about his civilian population. I think somebody in the European Parliament suggested, oh, we should, in response, like lockdown or like paralyze the Moscow underground. Putin doesn't care about that. He doesn't care whether his citizens have a good life or not. But he does care about his own bank account. So I think looking where do we actually have a strength, where does he have a weakness, and respond on that level, while at the same time strengthening our resilience so that we can also show, like, you can try your games, but we are actually, we are strong. We are not going to get panicky because of you. And I think we are moving actually in that direction. I actually thought the way we responded is moving in that direction, yeah.
If I may add something, I think we are always in the West one shot behind, okay? We are reacting to his provocations. For many months, I'm promoting, from my standpoint, nobody is listening to me, but I think we should do the same thing. Try to send drones over Russia to see how they react. And if they start shooting down our drones, well, in this case, it would mean that we have the legitimacy to shoot down their drones. And that's it. I don't know why we are so hesitant. I think we are scared, and that's the problem regarding will. I think in the West, we tend to be like, you know, a rabbit in front of the lights of a car at night. Why? Because he threatened us with nuclear retaliations and so on. And I remember at some point, there was this French... le porte-parole du gouvernement, I forgot his name, he was a doctor, what was his name? Anyway, he said very rapidly to a journalist, the journalist was asking him, what will happen if Putin is bombarding us with nuclear weapons? And the reaction was the correct one. I mean, we will do the same. I mean, he wipes out Paris, we will wipe out Moscow, and he knows perfectly well about that. So I think we should also provoke Russia, but at a low level, not because I think what Putin is wanting to do with that is to escalate. But I'm not saying we should start shooting MiG-31 that penetrate for 2 minutes in the airspace of one NATO country. But with the drones flying over Romania for 15 minutes, I think that we should, in this case, they finally decided to shoot them. We should do the same, just to see what the reaction of the Russians will be. I'm a bad guy, I'm a realist, okay? I'm a hawk, I'm a, terrible guy. But I mean, that's sometimes something we should do. You said yourself, the Russians understand only le langage de la force. Sometimes I think we will need to do something that will, also escalate a little bit to test their resolve. Voilà, that's what I think.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Thank you for
Afternoon.
Evening if you wish. Thank you for this very clear and concise conference. Across the conference, you've talked about the message. In terms of communication, what do we need to say to our European citizens in this room? Maybe there's a clear an understanding of what Russia is and the threat that Russia poses to the European welfare state, European Union, to the future of this union. But that's not evident across Europe. I'm from Spain, from Barcelona, and I know a lot of my friends, will not be willing to fight for Spain or fight in Russia. And it was very fascinating to hear you, an elected official, talk about the message, what we need to say to this European electoral base about Russia, about defense. But what about the business side of things? What about the enterprises? I don't know if you've heard SCAF, France, Germany, it's not going well. Yesterday there was a European Digital Summit. They were talking about cybersecurity, but the questions that were being asked and posed to Merz and Macron were about the SCAF, the future of this sixth-generation fighter that so far is going nowhere. And it's very concerning because we don't want to buy F-35s, the American supply base, but there's no clear European alternatives. The British are doing their own thing. So what message do we need to send to, for example, Dassault, Thales, that seem to not be willing to cooperate with Airbus, seem to be willing to prioritize French defense industry interest, and even Germany on their side of things? We've seen that, okay, there's massive investment on this new plan to make Germany's army the best in Europe and one of the best armies in the world, but they're prioritizing German suppliers, German tech pepites or startups. They're prioritizing German defense startups as well, not European startups, not European defense suppliers. What is the message that you, an elected official in very important defense committees in the European Parliament, can say to these enterprises? Look, there's a big threat. We need a European answer, not only from an electoral base, but also from a coordinated industrial business side way of things or approach. Thank you very much.
I'd been hoping to avoid FCAS. I mean, what it actually shows is that we are seeing a problem, but we are trying to solve it in ways where we're repeating the mistakes of the past. When we are talking, unfortunately, at the moment about a lot, and it's not just FCAS, it's a lot of issues, but when we're talking about it, you get the impression that it's one national industrial base versus the other national industrial base, and it's actually about who gets to build one, who gets the funds. I want to talk about what's the best system to defend us, and where do we get it for the best price. And I want to think of that way, that in a European way. So this is, I mean, here I come as a European member of Parliament, and that is exactly what we are trying to do. We are actually trying to create a common market of defense. That defense spending and defense investment is not about national industrial priorities, but is actually about, as I said, getting bang for the buck, and acquiring the capabilities we need. And I actually think we can probably save ourselves a lot of national debates between different industries if we say, for instance, let's first of all have common norms and standards, and then in the way you can split up things more. You can produce in different places. You can just see where it works best. And actually, what I also say defense companies is, this is your chance. Don't just think nationally. Think Europeanly. This is your chance to become the leader in whatever area you are, and to introduce a little bit more competition as well. But don't just think about your own country. Think about the market that is potentially there. You can become a European champion, but to do that, you might need to do what entrepreneurs should be doing, is a little bit of risk-taking. Don't be afraid of competition. Don't be afraid of the future. We have this debate at the moment where a lot of them are saying, ooh, I don't know whether we should invest in building new production capacity, because we don't know whether the states haven't actually signed the contract yet. Look at Russia, look at the defense spending, the contracts are gonna come. Have some entrepreneurial courage to actually start investing into that way, and we are doing our best to actually create a common market of defense where it's going to be about European weapons defending European peace.
If I may add something regarding the problems we have in Europe confronting one state, which is Russia. Russia is building its own weapons, so they are saving a lot of money on the production of the weapons. They are paying them in rubles. They decide what they do. They also have only one chain of command. So of course, in this potential future war, I think that we will have to surmount a lot of difficulties that the Russians don't have at the moment. And of course, I think that this problem is not solved, and it's far from being solved. I'm sorry if I insist on the F-35, but of course it sends the wrong message, just like the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, I think, was sending a very, very bad message to European solidarity. I'm sorry, I don't want to bash Germany or anything. But if I'm not wrong, Mr. Merz himself now mocked somebody in the Bundestag when somebody told him that Germany was too dependent on Russian energy. So he laughed, you know, and of course now we realize that it was the case. So I think that before we will be able, and I think that Europe is doing a lot of work. We are working in the right direction, producing artillery shells. I remember what you were saying before. The Leopard tanks is everywhere, even in Canada. So we don't have a lot of problems regarding tanks, at least. Okay, why? Because the German tanks are so good that everybody wants to buy tanks. But regarding aircraft, I think we have a problem in this case, and you mentioned that yourself. The Franco-German project is going nowhere. And I'm afraid that it will go nowhere. And Dassault will end up like in 1986 with its own aircraft. And the rest of Europe will do some things like the British with the Italians and the Japanese. And Germany, I don't know where they will go, but I suppose that they will join another. And France will go it alone again. But that's it. And Russia is in a very, very strong position regarding weapons productions and also command and control structure when they face Europe.
Yeah. I think we should probably start gathering questions because we want to make sure there's quite a queue. So maybe if we do three, it's okay. If we do 3 questions together.
Thank you very much for your intervention. I have one question. How are you in the Defense Committee navigating the rise of the far right? And so how are they already impeding European defense initiatives? And what is their transatlantic link? Thank you.
And then we do.
Yeah. Good evening, sir. First, thank you a lot for your presentation. I have one question. Why do we still believe in the United States' commitments towards the European security system? First, on the economic scope, we've had tariffs. Also, the United States are pushing for the decoupling of the European Union with China, pushing us basically to economic suicide. And also, on the other side, Trump has been negotiating with Putin over our heads. And fourth, I had the opportunity to work for the Polish Foreign Ministry, for the French also Foreign Ministry. I was in Washington. I've attended a lot of conferences out there, think tanks, and one thing that has been coming around a lot in my private conversations about, buying US equipment is basically if the US don't want Europe to use the equipment we acquire from them against something. For example, if Poland wants to use its F-35s to counter a threat coming from Russia, but the US do not agree with that, they can basically stop us from using them because there's this question of kill switches installed on American fighters being sold abroad. And also, coming out from this, there's this also the problem of spare parts that the US need to provide us for those types of equipment. So looking at those, looking at those elements, what can we think about the credibility of the United States commitment to, the European defense architecture? Thank you.
Your third one.
Hi. I think it's very interesting. You talk a lot about the extended government budget or the new debt the German government wants to issue for its defense spending, and then you also mentioned a lot of social cohesion. I pulled up some EFO numbers, and from my understanding now, it's about around 30 billion euros in additional government budget on debt to be used on defense. Only around 10 billion of those will actually go to defense, and the rest is being repurposed. And it's your party also that is pushing heavily for a continuous rise in pension payments, even though the demographic is changing dramatically, which the government can't really afford. And like more and more young people, you see the blockade of the youth sector of the Christian party is feeling more and more alienated from its old party. I feel like there's some sort of tyranny of old people, especially, I mean, in France, the average pensioner makes more than the average worker. German government pensions are like a third of the government budget. It's outrageous, really. I don't see a lot of intergenerational social cohesion here, and I think your party does a lot to push that further apart. and also it's like under the guise of a more, what do you say, better defense spending. I feel like there's a lot of misalignment there. Maybe you can go into that.
This is really for you.
I'm very happy to. Look at the German defense investment over the last 30 years. It has never been remotely close to the level that it is now. The Social Democratic Chancellor has for the first time put 100 billion in the first place, which was huge. And now a Social Democratic government has pushed through opening the debt brake, going to whatever it takes. And the money is already, the thing is defense takes a while, but it is already committed. And we are investing so much in defense that actually a lot of our European neighbors are now saying, ooh, you are doing almost too much. So I wouldn't see that at all. Like, it is this party that has been pushing that through. And you are absolutely right, we are pushing this through, but we are connecting it with investment into infrastructure on the one hand, and with a strong element of social cohesion. Because unfortunately, I get the arguments, and we understand that the level of pension has to change. Actually, Germany is still among the countries in Europe one of the ones where the pension system works relatively well compared to other countries in Europe. But we know, and this is actually a German, is actually a social democratic element that has been introduced, is to say, for instance, that the sanction level, the pension level slowly goes down. We've introduced that in 2005 with a social democrat. What we have done now, though, is for the next couple of years to freeze it at 48% until we actually create something where people can do more investment into private provisions. And I'm really somebody who gets, I wouldn't say annoyed, but like, how many people do you know who live off minimum pensions in Germany? It's less than 2,000 euros very often. And to then tell these people, we're going to cut your pension to build tanks, you're not going to get a single tank. We have to understand the realities of people we, unfortunately, in this room, a lot of us might not have very much contact with. And that is because our society is also falling apart. But we have to understand, we have to strengthen this social cohesion. We have to strengthen the idea of solidarity in our societies. We have to also look, it's easy for me to say, okay, I'm gonna get a little bit of a pay cut. It's easy for me to say, like, let's pull the belt tighter. But if I go into my cities and I see a lot of people who live off pension, they can't pull it much tighter. We have to change and make the pension system more sustainable in the long run. We have to find new creative ways of doing that. But I think in some ways, and I actually think it's relatively dangerous what the Junge Gruppe is doing, because they are basically implying it's either pensions or rockets. If you do that, you don't get rockets. If you do that, you get exactly what the AfD is pushing for, which is a broken apart society, which is large support for extremist parties, and which is a society that is in no way resilient. So I really insist on keeping that together. We need to reform the welfare state, but to say it's either the welfare state or strong defense is exactly the wrong approach. And this is why I'm actually really, really happy, not just because but it's part of why I ran for office. Because I really think you need the center-left parties to do that. We need the approach of the Norwegians, of the Swedes, and of the Finns, rather than an approach like the Americans, where it's just about defense spending and then you cut in everything else. I am proud of this European idea of defense and resilience being a whole of society approach, rather than one or the other. And I think it's actually social democrats that have to play a real role here. It was from Helmut Schmidt, but it's also, especially in the Nordic countries, that are doing that right now, and I think it's feasible.
For the two other questions, maybe?
Yeah, I'll be very...
Otherwise, it's a class on German domestic politics.
Yeah, but it was a question on that. But it's also like, this is a European thing. The need
absolutely.
for the center-right. I'm quite strong on that. Why the US, or why not to doubt the US commitment to Europe, or whether we should doubt it more? I think we are well advised to have some doubts, understand what's been happening, understand that we can't just pretend nothing has happened, but we also need to understand that they are not going to give us a free lunch anymore. They've been giving us a free lunch for a long time. And honestly, if I go to the United States, and I've lived there for quite a long time, and if I talk to people, there's like, why should 350 million Americans pay for this, like protect 450 million Europeans against 150 million Russians? And it's true. Like, we have profited of the United States for a long time, and we were very lucky that we could do that. But I think the request for burden sharing is nothing crazy. It's actually something that makes sense. My sense is that with the Americans, we have to show them that it's not charity to have Europe as an ally, but it's actually in their self-interest. This is why I think if we get stronger ourselves, it's in the American self-interest to be allied with us, because they are facing China. They want a strong ally as well. If we get stronger, they have an interest of working together with us, and also the idea of that all problems lie in the United States and they're unreliable because of Trump, etc. Completely true. But let's not pretend that that's not a problem we have in other European countries as well. We have Orban in Hungary. I'm really hopeful that in 2027 the elections here don't go wrong. The rise of the populist right, and that brings me to the third point, is not an American export to Europe. On the contrary, it's a European export to America in many ways. This is actually what I try not to go too long, but it's like I wrote my PhD on that. If you actually look on the rise of the MAGA movement, who are their intellectual fathers? They don't quote to you Buckley or some other American conservatives. They talk about Charles Maurras. They talk about the Nouvelle Droite. They talk about the ideas that come from Europe of the identitarian movement. And we need to understand that just saying, oh, we get rid of the Americans, won't get rid of that problem. We will continue to see that problem. And this is why ultimately it's also the question, how do we deal with the far right in our parliaments? On the one hand, on foreign affairs is relatively easy, because they are, A, pretty incompetent, they don't have solutions. And if they talk, they really, one of my neighbors, he's Dutch, and he always says, because for instance, the German far right make a point of always speaking in German. He always says like, oh, that speech was delivered in German, but it was clearly written in Russian. And they're harming themselves with that point, because people aren't stupid. They see that these people are not loyal to Europe or Germany or France. They are much more loyal to the Kremlin. And I think we need to stress that point much more, that these parties are not great alternatives for Germany or for France or for whatever country. They are a national security threat, and we need to be very, very clear about that. That if these parties get elected, it's not about immigration, it's not just about other matters of our societies, but it will be a national security risk in our posture towards Russia and other parts of the world.
Thank you. Three last questions, Jonathan. And
Yes, thank you for this amazing discussion. I was wondering if you really think that the US has a reliable extended deterrence towards Europe. It strikes me like, you mentioned that the Cold War, it worked out fine, right? But it strikes me that things have changed quite a lot. Now Trump is making statements about a big, beautiful ocean, and he said that, well, you can do what the hell you want with certain allies and so on. And that, I mean, strikes me as just inherently uncredible as a premise for a deterrence, where we're talking about possibly trading Berlin for Boston, right? And I don't see Trump really making that decision. So if you could develop on how you think that's credible.
Hello, thank you very much for this discussion as well. Originally, I come from Odessa, but I've been living in, it's a small, who doesn't know, it's a small, relatively small town on the shore of Ukraine. It's amazing, probably you've been there, right? Yeah, so, but I've been living in European Union for the most of my life. Recently I moved to Finland from Denmark. I am writing for Danish magazines, and my most recent article was about Finland's defense, and there I wrote a lot of points that you were talking about as well, about this cohesion that they definitely have in society, about how they perceive, and for them it's mostly not about the defense and immunities, but mostly about the people who they are surrounded with, and that I adore about the country a lot. So my question that I wanted to ask you is, what should be, in what areas does European defense need some, not just moves, but some sort of game-changing moves to change the whole direction where we are going with defense? And what would be then the risks of disrupting the status quo by attempting such changes? Thank you so much.
Good evening, thank you so much. In this whole talk, I find that there's like one more puzzle piece missing for me, which is the most depressing one probably, which is the Visegrad 4. And they're like ever hardening line that is ever more so anti-EU and pro-Russian, mutually. I think those sentiments are also mutually fueling themselves. And I guess, you know, we can exempt Poland from this, although the Nawrocki election is not looking too bright either. So I wonder, in your opinion, what does this line mean, for the future of EU defense, for Putin's imagination, and potentially even more importantly, at this moment, what can the EU do to bring these governments and potentially even these populations more on board with the collective foreign policy, especially in a time where budget constraints are really, really strong? Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, I try to be quick. I'll start with the last one again, and you're absolutely right, and I think it's becoming increasingly hard to go home to also my own constituency and say that we make our own security dependent on the toilet breaks of Viktor Orban. That is unsustainable. We can't make our security dependent on individuals who clearly have no interest in that and who consider themselves more loyal to Moscow than the rest. The question is, how do we get around that? And I think already what is positive is that we are now moving, especially in the European Parliament, along. We're actually debating that in Strasbourg next week, of saying if you act against the interests, the security interests of the European Union, your voting rights might be suspended. Your veto rights might be suspended. It's not something we do easily because sovereignty of member states is absolutely essential. But if you do that, you might have to consider that, and I'm almost hopeful. The thing is, like, even Viktor Orban, I sometimes think would be good to do a little bit less ideology and a little bit more geography. Because if there is actually an escalation between NATO and between NATO and Russia, Trump is not going to come and fly in and like save Hungary. They're not part of the United States. They are in the EU. They are going to be part of that. So it is in their inherent security interest to have a strong European defense posture. And I actually think that most people know that in these countries. The interesting thing is, like, Viktor Orban does his thing, but most Hungarians actually quite strongly disagree with him on foreign affairs. They have voted for him for different issues. And it's the same actually in the Czech Republic. They have voted for these populists not because they think, oh, we really like Russia, but for other reasons. So I think for us the challenge is, on the one hand, to address these other issues, whether they be once again, welfare questions, but also questions of migration, etc. But on the other hand, also be very clear and moving up the priority of the security part and actually saying, be careful what you vote for. Be careful what you wish for. You might actually vote somebody into that is a real threat to your own security. In the medium to long run, I would just love to democratize our decision-making process. We are all about democracy in Europe. We need QMV. We can't make ourselves every single time dependent on individual member states blocking. We need to actually dare a little bit more democracy. And the good thing is, because a lot of countries that traditionally have been very skeptical of QMV, of qualified majority voting, also realize, I don't really want to be dependent on Hungary for my defense as well. Talking about, for instance, the Baltic countries, there's a little bit of movement. Second question was about what game-changing things we need to do and what risk that might be for the status quo. I think the game-changing thing has already been that a couple of years ago, debate like we had today, when I was sitting in these seats, which is not that long ago, unimaginable. The people are understanding that geopolitics, unfortunately, is back with a vengeance. Shouldn't have been surprised, but they're understanding it now. And we are talking in a way about Europe and the European Union as that what it was initially conceived for. It wasn't supposed to just be a single market. People didn't think initially about the measurements of bananas or charging cables, all of these things. Europe was a peace project. And this is what we ultimately will have to go back to. Europe is our key, and people understand that we can only defend ourselves in this changing world. And once again, it's not just about Russia. We are moving from a unipolar moment where, at least in theory, the US might have not always stuck to the rules, but there was an idea of the US enforcing a rules-based international order. That's going. We are moving to a multipolar order. And I still think it's in our interest to remain rules-based, and actually there are loads of countries that want the same thing. There are lots of countries that actually, like if you think about Canada, if you think about Australia, if you think about Norway, if you think about Iceland, if you think about even India, the EU has never been so sexy internationally. They all come to us now and say, like, we actually are interested in the rules-based international order. Let's keep that going. But we know that we can only do that if we do that together. Germany alone, France alone can't do that. So I think this step, our citizens and actually the people looking at us from the outside are a couple of steps further than we are, and that is actually already the groundbreaking thing. We are starting to think of Europe very, very differently, and I think we will also have to make the institutional moves. I believe that we will do that because politicians ultimately follow voters, and that is a big change that wasn't there before. Finally was, whether to what extent we can trust that the American deterrent will work against Russia. I still think probably it's a little bit less deterrent than it was a couple of years ago, but I still couldn't think of anything that's more deterrent. I think Henry Kissinger once said that it's a 5% probability of them striking back is usually enough to deter, or should be about enough to deter a nuclear attack by Russia. Because even if there's a small chance of them retaliating, that should stop you from committing suicide. And the reason why it's actually more likely that the Americans would respond than anybody else is that the Americans don't need to sacrifice Boston. If, for instance, Russia used a tactical nuclear weapon, which would be the most likely scenario, they wouldn't straight go and blow up Paris. At the moment, Brits or French, we have strategic nuclear weapons. We could only respond by escalating and blowing up Moscow. What the Americans can do is actually also use a tactical nuclear weapon in response. And they also have the means. We don't know, there's nothing with certainty, but there is at least a pretty good chance that they could respond without putting Boston, without certainty of sacrificing Boston. They would have a second strike capacity that many other countries wouldn't have. So the American nuclear deterrent is a whole different quality, and therefore it's more likely that they might actually be willing to use it, because for them it's not definite suicide to use it. Once again, this is psychology. A lot of this is not science in a way. A lot of this is speculation. I actually think the less we speculate about that, the better, because as I say, if it's 5%, then Putin is probably not going to do it, and Putin doesn't want to commit suicide. So once again, I also think we shouldn't focus too much on the nuclear issue. I don't actually take the Russian nuclear threat, I don't actually think that they really, really want to do that. And I don't think it's in our interest to keep escalating in that direction. I think at this stage, we have a good chance to get Russia to the negotiating table. If we show strength on the conventional level, if we support Ukraine, we can hopefully get Putin also a way out of this war that is disastrous for himself. He just needs to understand that we will do this from a position of strength. That is the language he understands.
Thank you, Dankeschön. Thank you very much. It's very unfortunate that we cannot discuss more about nuclear strategy, because I had something to say, but that was not my show.
Sorry.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, Dankeschön.
Very good. Bravo.
Yeah.
Wow, very excellent.
Yeah.
Very good questions.
I mean, I enjoyed it. I mean, the thing is, like,
You like it.
I do.
feel it.
I do go in. I do usually come out